when we wind forward to Ukraine, we again have seen the extensive use of chemical weapons, and it's been incredibly effective. Now, it started really in the second year of the war, on a fairly small scale, mainly in the Donbass area. And what was happening is the Russians were putting small hand grenades full of something called chloropicrin. Chloropicrin was developed in the First World War as a chemical weapon. It is more an incapacitant, as we call it, rather than a killer. It's not fatal. A lot of people know chloropicrin as riot control agent. It's used to control riots across the world. But chloropicrin is a designated chemical weapon under the Chemical Weapons Convention. Therefore, its use in Ukraine is illegal by the Russians. The modus operandi is to drop chloropicrin into trenches, and for the majority of the Ukraine soldiers who don't have respirators, gas masks, it's incredibly unpleasant. It's so unpleasant that you've got to get away from it. So it meant that Ukrainian soldiers got out of their trenches to try and get away from the gas. At the same time, the Russians would attack them with artillery and attack drones, and it's been incredibly effective. Even last weekend, I was speaking to medics in the Petrovsk region down in the southeast of Ukraine who had been under severe attack from the Russians, and that attack was led by chloropicrin and chemical weapons. Slightly different modus operandi this time. The drones are firing 40-millimeter cartridges full of this chemical weapon into trenches, again being very effective. The way to get around it for the Ukrainians is to have gas masks. Unfortunately, a lot of the gas masks that they had were the old Soviet ones, old Russian ones, which were not very effective against chloropicrin. So recently, the British government have announced that they will be providing several thousand British gas masks to the front line, and hopefully when they arrive, this will become less of an issue. But the majority of the advances that Russia have made, particularly in the Petrovsk area and other areas down in the Donbass, has been by the use of these chemical weapons. Chloropicrin is really achieving what they're trying to do. And it sort of links back to, as I was saying earlier, in Syria, the Assad regime used a lot of chlorine. Now, chlorine is a readily available toxic industrial hazard, but it was used extensively in the First World War over 100 years ago. And although it's not very toxic, it was very effective in Syria because people were not protected with gas masks. Similarly, in Ukraine, chloropicrin is having the same effect. It's very difficult if a soldier is in a trench and well protected, it's very difficult to defeat them, even with lots of conventional artillery and direct fire and tanks. But if you throw gas into a trench, then they have to get out. So it's been effective. But there is a concern that, if the Russians did start to use some of their deadly nerve agents like Novichok, then, that would directly kill people rather than chloropicrin, which is indirectly killing people. Well, I think there are two things to consider here. Firstly, I think the Russians are using chloropicrin because to most people in the world, they know it as CS gas, riot control agents, and in a bizarre way that the world legal system works, if you use riot control agents on the civilian population, it is not illegal. But if you use it in warfare, it is illegal. So the Russians are hoping, because of this uncertainty, that they can get away with using it. If the Russians use Novichok, the most deadly nerve agent that has ever been made, they would not have that confusion amongst some people. So I think that is a reason why they might not use it. Having said all that, there seems to be very little that the Russians are not prepared to do. It is having an impact. We know the Russians, one of the key reasons it seems that Putin doesn't want a ceasefire or peace at the moment is his troops are making gains, across the whole contact line, and particularly in the area of Petrovsk. And that seems to have been stimulated by the use of these chemical weapons over the weekend. It's very easy to counter this threat. And the way to do that is with a really good respirator gas mask. Now, this is something that the Ukrainian soldiers on the front line have been calling for really since the chemical weapons started being used 2 years ago. Unfortunately, it's been quite low down the list of what Western countries like the UK and the US want to provide or have provided, because the Ukraine leaders in Kyiv have been crying for Storm Shadow missiles, ATACMS and HIMARS and fighter jets, and the desire for small bits of non-lethal equipment like respirators have fallen to the bottom of the pile. However, I understand that that has changed in the United Kingdom, which does produce the majority of the high-quality gas masks in the world, have now put money aside and are now starting to deliver respirators to the front line, but it will take time to get there. And the UK, I believe, is providing several thousand, but actually the Ukraine army is, 200,000 or 300,000. So there won't be enough for everybody, but it's a good start. And if other countries decide to follow suit, then once the frontline troops have their gas masks, then these attacks will become ineffective. And that is where potentially the Russians might want to use a more highly lethal chemical weapon. But even with a good gas mask, they too would be ineffective. So it is, with any threat, there is always a counter to it. And it's a question of how quickly you can do it. But getting gas masks to the front line has taken a long time, but they have started to come now. And once everybody has one, these attacks, I expect, will stop.